multiple books. She is a neuroscientist and a leading expert on how children learn. For over 15 years, she has served as adjunct associate professor at Northwestern University. Please help me welcome Dr. Martha Burns.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. I'm so delighted that we have such a large group today and all over the country. That's quite exciting. So as you know, we're going to be talking about the new science of learning for children who are struggling to learn how to read. And when we're talking about the new science of learning, what essentially we're doing is applying neuroscience. We're looking at the ability of neuroscience to profoundly impact the educational process. So those are the two parts of this first image that you see on the right-hand side. We have the educational process on the bottom right-hand corner, referring to curriculum, the content and what it is teachers teach. And then what we have is neuroscience that profoundly impacts our ability to educate in general, and it's becoming more and more of a force in our understanding of how children learn and what we can do to help children learn. In addition to that, the new science of learning includes the role of the psychologist in helping us to understand cognitive differences in some children. So aside from intelligence, the vast majority of the children in our schools are capable of learning. They have perfectly normal IQs, but some of them are struggling to learn because of various factors. It might be language problems, it might be attentional issues, it might be diagnosis of a specific learning disability, and it is psychologists who've helped us to understand those reasons that children can struggle with learning. But really the impact for today that I'm going to be emphasizing is how the combination of neuroscience and psychology has guided our development of breakthrough technologies that can enhance the ability to learn, enhance attentional skills, enhance memory skills, enhance a host of processing capabilities, and that's where I'm going to be emphasizing in today's talk. So just in case you're interested in this further and going a little bit further with the whole concept of neuroscience and the contribution of science to our understanding of education, there was a wonderful issue of the journal of the magazine Scientific American that was published to get ready for school in 2003, last July, that has a compilation of some excellent articles on the new science of learning. And if you want even a newer source, the New York Times, just a couple of weeks ago, in their science pages, which occur on Tuesday in the New York Times, had a summary of some of the brand new research that is going on in terms of what's called connectomics or connectomes, understanding actually being able to look at the brain. If you can see here, what you're seeing, the green and red and yellow lines are actually myelinated fibers, and they're these big connecting pathways, the highway system of the brain, and how we can look at the highway system of the brain and be able to diagnose more easily children who are prone to attentional problems, or perhaps diagnose children faster and earlier who might be at risk for developing autism spectrum disorders or have difficulties with reading. And with this advent of this new research that's going on really all over the world, we're moving very, very quickly in our understanding of why some children struggle to learn. And I should add, for those of you who know individuals who have emotional problems as adults or mental illness, the connectomics is also looking at how the brain is organized differently if somebody has a diagnosis, let's say, of schizophrenia or of bipolar disorder. So this is a huge area of investigation, and it's really helping inform us about what we can do to help children learn better, and that's really where I'm going to be focusing today. Now, we're going to be looking at some scans of fiber tracts, and we're going to be looking at some fMRI scans, functional magnetic resonance imaging scans of the brain at work. And so that you'll know what you're looking at, I know many of you have seen many of these on television and in newspapers and magazines, but just so you know what we're looking at specifically for learning and reading, I've taken a slide from Stanislaus Dehaene's book, Reading in the Brain, to just point out what we're going to be looking at. So what you see on the left is the left hemisphere of the brain, and as I'm sure all of you know, the brain is divided into 4 lobes. And so each of the hemispheres, we have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere of the brain. The right hemisphere is very important for social skills. It turns out the left hemisphere is very important for school and for handling symbols, which I'll explain in a minute. The back 3 lobes that are behind this vertical line that you see here are the parietal lobe, which is important for body sensation, body sense, and the number sense. The occipital lobe, which is very important for anything that comes into our eyes, vision, and the temporal lobe, which is very important for anything that we hear. Now, the brain, these sensory lobes of the brain are very plastic, so if someone is blind, the occipital lobe will recruit neurons from the occipital lobe to do other things like hear. So this is not set in stone, but these particular capacities that we're talking about are the sensory capacities that we have for dealing with our environment and for learning. And so that we call the receptive part of the brain. Now, everything in front of this vertical line is the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is what we use to do things, to act on the world around us. And in terms of learning, the frontal lobe is what we use to be able to do a math problem, or to be able to read out loud, or to be able to answer questions about what we've read, or to be able to plan ahead and figure out when we're going to do our homework. So the frontal lobe has a lot of responsibilities that enable us to act on the world in an effective way. Now, the left hemisphere, as I said, is important for the symbol systems. And what that means is that because we have these 3 sensory lobes, the parietal, body sense and number sense, the occipital, vision, the temporal, sound, when we have a symbol, like a letter that stands for a sound, like the letter A that stands for the sound ah or ah, what we have to do is we have to be able to link that sound, ah, with that visual symbol, the letter. And you can see over here that letter is recognized in what's the visual word form area of the occipital lobe. So we need neurons that can integrate sound with letter, and those happen to be right here at the angle that you see that's formed where the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe come together. And that angle is aptly named the angular gyrus. Gyrus is just Latin for bump, and so angular just means the bump at the angle. And the angular gyrus then is the integrator in the left hemisphere, and it enables us to handle not just reading symbols, which are the symbols of the letters that stand for sounds, but mathematical symbols, which are visual numerals that stand for numbers. And then we can take symbols and have symbols of symbols. So when we get into algebra, you can have X that stands for a number, which stands for a numeral. So this symbol center is very important. It builds as we learn new vocabulary. It builds and gets thicker as we mature and get better at reading. And it's very important for reading, you're going to see in a few minutes. So let's look at now is the architecture that is going to develop in the first 4 years of life, of your student's life, that's going to enable them when they enter school to be able to do something like read. And the architecture that's very important is a network. We have lots of networks in the brain, and networks are regions of the brain. You see them here as these yellow lights on this functional magnetic image that are all where the neurons in those areas are distributed across the brain, but they're all firing at the same rate. So the adage that we use is neurons that fire together, that have the same rhythm, wire together into networks. And these networks you can think of the way you would think of four-wheel drive on a car, where you've got 4 wheels that are all linked together by the drivetrain and by the axles, and the tires are all rotating at the same rate. And if any of you now are in a part of the world that's very cold with a lot of snow, like Chicago is, you are familiar with skidding, where one of the wheels rotates at a different level, and then the car literally stops and may even spin around. And the same thing happens in the brain. If the neurons aren't firing at exactly the synchronous rate, then these networks don't develop well and don't function well. So part of the first 4 to 5 years of life is developing these basic structural networks. This one is the network for language. We also have a network for mathematics that involves some of the same areas. Well, I'll show you in a minute. And almost all of them are going to eventually enable us to use the angular gyrus, which happens to be right here, that bump that is the connector between vision and sound and number sense or body sense, if you're looking at a symbol like a map. That is going to be integral for learning things like mathematics and for learning language. So before we can learn to read, I've got to build up the network for language, because as far as the brain is concerned, reading is a language network and depends on the language network. Now, the way the brain builds these networks is in a very hierarchical way, very specific way over time. One of the first things that builds in the brain for language is the capacity to hear the sounds of your native language. So if your native language is English, which most of us, it is our native language, we have to be able to tell the difference between a B sound and a D sound. We have to tell the difference between a D sound and a K sound. And we have to tell the difference between a B sound and a G sound. And so the brain is going to have to learn how to do that. And it's going to have to learn how to do that for each language that's going to be learned, to know the sounds that that language is made up of. And that happens within the first few years of life. And it happens based on how much language a child hears, how many words they hear. The more words a child hears, the better able the brain is to develop a map that coincides with the sounds the child has to know. So here what you see is research that was done by Edward Chang and his associates, published a few years ago, 2010, where they placed an electrode grid of 100 little tiny electrodes right on the surface of the superior temporal lobe, the top of the temporal lobe right here, because we know that the temporal lobe is very important for listening and hearing and perception. And they had these 4 adults who had the electrodes placed right on the surface of their brain listen to words like bay or day or big or dig. And if they could tell whether it was a B or a D, they would signal. And then what the researchers could do is associate which group of neurons were tied to that ability to distinguish one set of sounds from another. So what you can see here, let's just look at subject number 1. These red neurons up here, and this little blotch of neurons probably corresponds to about 150 neurons. These neurons were active whenever the person had to listen for a difference in 2 words that start with a B versus a D, like bay versus day. The green dots, another 150 or so neurons, were very interested if the difference was between D and G, like in dig versus gig. And then the blue ones, as you can see here in subject 4, were interested if the difference was between a B and a G. Now, that's a very systematic way that the brain maps itself. It takes time for the brain to map itself, and it takes exposure to language. It takes many, many, many repetitions of words over and over and over again in a context that is meaningful enough to the child that those maps are built. Other parts of the brain are going to map as well. So the inferior frontal lobe that we use for doing things like talking, for example, is also going to have to map. And it's going to have to map for things like grammar. It's going to have to be able to tell the difference between the boy is running and the boys are running. Listen for the difference in that little word, or tell the difference between the boy kicks and the boys kick, where the only difference is the sequence of where that little Z occurred. Does it occur at the end of boy, or does it occur at the end of kick? If it occurs at the end of boys, means we have lots of boys. If it occurs at the end of kick, it means there's only one. And so children, that human brain has to sort out all of these aspects of speech and language and sequencing and build up these marvelous maps that then, when a child enters school, they can use when they're trying to map a letter to a sound, or when they're trying to figure out what the word saw looks like versus what the word see looks like versus what the word was looks like. Okay, now the way that the different areas of the brain are going to connect with each other to make these networks, the way the top of the temporal lobe map that's going to distinguish a B from a D is going to be able to communicate with the frontal lobe so that you can say bay and not say day when you want to say bay, is going to be these long fiber tracts. And the long fiber tracts are actually part of every neuron. So what you're seeing here is 3 neurons. These are these little silver circles here. And those neurons are connected with each other by long fiber tracts that we call axons. Axons send information, and axons are like a long arm that reaches out from a neuron to connect with a neuron far away in many cases. And when those neurons, because they're long and because they have to extend over a big long area of the brain, they're wrapped in an insulating material, and that insulating material happens to be fat, and it's called myelin. And so for the brain to function well, this myelin has to be thick, and those axons have to be well myelinated so that information can travel quickly and efficiently throughout the brain and link these different parts of these networks together. Now, in addition to the long fiber tracts that the brain develops, every time we learn something new or do something new, another bit of connection occurs, and that is with the fingers of each neuron that we call dendrites. Dendrites receive information, and so dendrites will reach out and touch another neuron, or a dendrite might reach out and grab onto an axon. That's what you're seeing down here in the lower right-hand corner, and then it can receive the information that the axon is sending. And so it's that connection or communication system that builds up over years of a child's development and prepares the child when they get into school. Now, one of the major superhighways that we care about for reading and learning, and there are lots of important big highways. You can see some of them here in this image. But a big one that's very important for school is this big blue highway. It isn't blue in the brain, of course. They're all white, actually. But it has been highlighted here for us. It has a name, the superior longitudinal fasciculus, which is just a big, long word that means the top long fiber tract. And this top long fiber tract is going to link that map of sounds that you saw right here in the temporal lobe with the angular gyrus, which is the area that can link those sounds to the visual image of the word, of the sound, of the letter, and carry that forward to the frontal lobe where we can use it. And coincidentally, this particular blue fiber tract starts maturing at about 5 years of age, and it continues to mature into our late teens. So it coincides almost perfectly with the years that a student is in school. And so I often say that this blue highway is a highway that teachers build, because we know from research by Stanislav Dehaene that this network is much bigger in the left hemisphere of individuals who have been taught how to read, who are literate, versus those who've never gone through formal education. And so this is an important highway that's going to be dependent on the underlying map here of sounds and some underlying maps in the frontal lobe that enable speech. And that's going to enable us to link all of that to symbol systems and use it for math and for reading. So if we look then at the reading brain, and if we look at Stanislav Dehaene's book that he wrote, that I've taken some of these images from, and it is Reading in the Brain, and you can get it at Amazon.com. If we look at the reading brain, what you can see is that in a young reader, you can see this activation of this area, this little butterfly-looking symbol there in the left hemisphere, is what the student is using to link this sound map, ba, da, ga, with the visual symbols of the word in the occipital lobe. And that's then what you're looking at in that upper left-hand corner is a child decoding. The child is sounding out words. So he looks at a word like H-O-U-S-E, and he goes, oh, and if he knows the E is silent, he goes, oh, house. And he's able to do that. Now, a young reader also, will use their right hemisphere and look at pictures to help them guess. So if he sees a picture of a house and he goes, oh, and then he sees a house, he'll go, oh, house. But if he sees a picture of a horse, he might go, oh, horse. And he's able to guess based on the picture that that's what the word is. Once we get to an adult competent reader, there's much less dependence, as you can see here, on sounding words out. we have the activation of this angular gyrus, this important part of the world to handle symbols very quickly. And you can see that that big blue fiber track we talked about, that big blue highway is very well intact because a lot of work is going on in the frontal lobe to help the person not just to now read, but to attach meaning to it, to learn from it, to use it to do other things. So reading becomes a tool that we use to accomplish a lot of other things in an adult. And that's why you see the activation of the frontal lobe and you see less activity of the right hemisphere. We need less picture books as we get older, unless we're taking a new course like physics or something where pictures might be helpful for us. Now, that gets us then to the big question, is what are the factors that would cause reading to be a problem in children? Why is reading hard for some children and not for others? And there are several factors that we know that can impact the organization of the brain for reading. One, I'm going to talk about very early in this talk, the second language learner, where we have a student who his first language might be an Asian language or it might be a Latin language like Spanish, and that student then is coming to school, and not only is that student expected to learn English, but they're also expected to read English books, and they're expected to listen to a teacher teach mathematics with English. So second language learning it does affect the speed with which a child can learn to read and also learn other aspects in education. Some other factors are anything that interferes with the number, the pure quantity of language the child is exposed to. So if we have a parent who is in a single parent home and the mom has 2 jobs and she has 3 other children, and when she gets home at night, she's trying to make the ends meet financially, she's trying to prepare meals, she's trying to clean the house, she's trying to get the kids' homework done, she's trying to make sure that the clothes are ready for them to wear tomorrow. That parent doesn't have the luxury of sitting around with a 2-year-old reading a lot of books to them. And so we know from research by Hart and Risley that parents who are under a lot of financial stress are often not having the luxury of talking as much to their children. And so those children have less exposure to language in general, and they just don't have as much quantity, so it takes longer for the brain to develop the network, pure and simple. Now, another thing that can affect a child's ability to learn language is if they've had anything that would interfere with the words getting into the brain. So a hearing loss, or even just having lots of colds or allergies in the first year of life or first 2 year of life can really affect the way the brain, how much information the brain gets. So if you have a middle ear infection, let's say, you and I, our middle ear will be cleared out by the eustachian tube, often within a few days. And so a cold may affect our hearing. We might notice our hearing is affected for a few days. A child, it can last 10 weeks or around that, just to clear out that middle ear, especially if they've had an infection in that middle ear. The fluid sticks around longer, and I'll explain that more later. But that causes a 30% hearing loss, and if you have a 30% hearing loss, that means 30% of the information coming in isn't getting to the brain. And if that's the case, then the brain doesn't have as much information to build these networks around. Now, we also have children who have specific language issues where language is just not their strong suit. I'll talk about that more. We have children who have attentional problems that may be hereditary or may be related to other kinds of issues. Can talk about that in a few minutes, like they might have a language problem, and so attending to language is hard. They might have trouble remembering things, so maintaining their attention is hard. I'll talk about that. And then we have children who have specific diagnoses, like dyslexia, for example, that can impact their ability to read. So let's talk about all of these. Let's start with English language learners. We know that more and more children in our schools are coming where English is their second language. We know that from the last 2 major censuses that have been done. And what I'd like to share with you is research that was done by Joy Hirsch and her colleagues at Columbia University with bilingual adults. And we're looking here at the brain from on top. So a slice is being taken when you see this green line. The top of the brain, it's just technologically been eliminated, and we are looking at the brain from on top. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain at the bottom. And then what you're looking at in this green square is the language area that's important for speech. And what you can see is this bilingual adult learned 2 languages, Turkish and English, before they were 5 years of age. Notice that for that person, those 2 languages are 1. So a lot of the neurons are orange, meaning that for that person, Turkish and English are just one big language. We could say this person speaks Tinglish because they have lots of Turkish words, they have lots of English words, they have lots of Turkish grammar, English grammar, Turkish sounds, speech sounds, English speech sounds, and they're all together. And the area is quite large, and that person is quite facile with both languages. But if you look at a child who's learned their second language after they're 5 years of age, then what happens, and that's typical of what happens when we have students as English language learners in our school, then what you see is there's no overlap at all. You see the first language, in this case, is English. The second language is French. There is no overlap. This person might still be bilingual, but they're often going to still have an accent or a dialect because of their native language being more dominant. And you're also going to see that they sometimes have to translate, especially if they're trying to learn in their second language and the learning is complex. And it takes about as long, about 4 to 4.5 years, to get that second language area to be developed and to be strong. So immediately what we have when we have a child who's an English language learner is a child whose reading is going to take longer. It's going to take them 4 to 5 years longer to learn how to read in English than a child who comes in with English as their native language. And when a child is a second language learner, when English is their second language, the sounds are not as distinct. The sounds overlap. They sound kind of nutty like this. So it's hard to tell the difference between do, do, do. Those sounds all sound the same to them. They're just a little muddier. But what we can do with technology is we can actually do what's called glasses for the ears. We can take those sounds, just like you can use the lens of your glasses, and lengthen the visual spectrum in certain ways and magnify the vision so that you can see images more clearly. We can do the same thing with sounds and make it easier for the children to hear the sounds by making them longer and louder so they're stretched and emphasized. And we can teach them to listen to words like ba, 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 da, and press a button when the word changes. We can do exercises like that they see as video games and think are fun, but you're actually using this acoustically modified speech, these glasses for the ears, to amplify the differences in the sounds. And then you can train them out of needing them. So imagine if you have astigmatism, you would have glasses for a little while, but gradually the glasses would change so that by the time, after 6 weeks of using the glasses, you wouldn't need glasses anymore. And that's what we're able to do with technology. That's one of the ways that technology, neuroscience-based technology, is a breakthrough to enhance both attention and auditory processing. Now, how do these maps develop? Well, as I said, they develop over time. And the original research we did on this auditory cortex and how these maps develop showed us that, this is in animals, showed us that in an animal, when an animal's first born or when a human's first born, what you have is a lot of neurons that look here like they're gray. And that means that they haven't committed themselves yet to hearing certain sounds. So in this animal, this is a 16-day-old mouse, for example, what you have over here that looks like a rainbow is a frequency spectrum. It's like the keys of a piano. The red would be the high notes and blue would be the low notes. And you can see at 16 days of age, this particular animal has a lot of gray neurons that they're hearing, they're attending to sound, but they haven't specialized yet in a specific sound. And over time, what happens is the neurons start to specialize. And it takes time in animals for that to occur. It takes time in human beings. The time it takes for a child to be able to have this nice, beautiful map of the brain for the sounds of their native language is probably around 4 years of age. And so what I said earlier is that if you have something like fluid in your middle ear, you don't even need, this is just an audiogram if you've ever had your hearing tested, you don't even need to have a hearing loss diagnosed. You just need a lot of colds in the first 2 years of life. And if those colds are having fluid in your middle ear for 10 weeks at a time, 4 colds means that 40 weeks out of 52, you have a flat 30 decibel loss, 30% hearing loss. And when that happens, you are masking out. That child is not able to hear a lot of very important speech sounds like an F sound in front, or an F sound in sing, or a Z sound in boys, or a V sound in ballet, or a P sound, or an H sound, or a D sound, or a K sound. Those sounds are going to be very hard for the child to hear. So oftentimes they're going to mix words up, and they're going to think that they heard a Z when they heard a V, and that just slows down the ability of the brain to make maps. Now, something else that can slow down the ability of the brain to make these maps can be just an inherited predisposition to not be so good at language. So what you see here on the right-hand side is some electrophysiological scans of young children, about 4 months old, who are listening to sounds. Some of the sounds are slow, beep, beep, and some of the sounds are close together, beep, beep. And they're just seeing how their brain responds to those sounds compared to children who don't have a family history of language problems. And what you can see is when children come from families where language is easy, they discriminate very slow sounds and fast sounds just equally as well. Their brain is very good at picking up on differences in sounds, especially sounds that occur quickly, like speech sounds. But for children who come from a family where language problems or reading problems occur, they seem to have already, when they're 4 months old, long before we've ever seen whether they're going to develop language slowly or quickly, their brain just isn't as good at rapid sounds. And it turns out speech sounds occur very fast. And so it means language isn't going to be their strong suit. And I often say to people, I have a brain where there are lots of things that aren't my strong suit. One of my weakest suits, if you will, is physical agility. I'm just a klutz. And it turns out being a klutz doesn't interfere with school, so I was able to get a PhD. But my husband is a pro athlete, and he so hopes that our children would have great athletic skill, and unfortunately my genes seem to have won out on that bit. So we have this genetic predisposition to have aptitude in some areas and not in others, and so sometimes that can explain some of the differences that we see. But we know that technology, again, has been developed that can really change and improve auditory processing very quickly and very efficiently, even when it's relatively severely impaired. So a colleague of mine, Nicole Russo, in Nina Krause's lab at Northwestern, where I teach, did a wonderful study with children who were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders. These children were 10 years of age, and she could see that they had marked auditory processing problems based on several different kinds of measures she used. But one of the measures was just to be able to track a pitch, a sound, going from high to low. Ah! And before the children did any intervention, neuroscience intervention, you can see the tracking was very poor. Their brain just wasn't good at following changes in pitch. But after just 6 weeks of something called the Fast Forward program that really is emphasizing auditory processing, those curves became much more normal and tracking improved. So auditory processing itself is another area where we have breakthrough technologies now developed by neuroscience that can improve processing skills. Now, what about attention? What we know with children who have auditory processing skills problems is they're often inattentive and distractible, but their auditory processing, sometimes called CAPD, central auditory processing disorders, we know cause problems in school, especially where there's background noise or whether they have trouble following directions and listening carefully to the teacher. But we have students who are inattentive and distracted. As you well know, they have a diagnosis of attention disorders. And in addition to being inattentive or distracted in a classroom, they might also be very fidgety and hyperactive. We have other children who have attentional disorders, but no evidence of hyperactivity. That's often called ADD, or attention deficit disorder without hyperactivity. And those students often have a working memory problem. They have trouble holding auditory information in their mind. And if a child has trouble holding auditory information in their mind, they tune out. So if a teacher's talking, they stop paying attention to the teacher. They may not act out, they may not be hyperactive, but they might go into la la land. They might start just, daydreaming in a classroom. And so we know that if we can improve working memory, we can often improve attentional skills in those children. And we also know in children with ADHD that we can actually train attention skills through this breakthrough technology we've been talking about. So this is a study done by Courtney Stevens in Helen Neville's Brain Research Lab in Oregon. And what you see is they studied children who, a group of children, children who were average 7 years of age. One group had a language impairment. One group was typically developing, had no language or reading problems. And they did, with the children, some of them got what was called fast forward language, which actually addresses attention and memory and the speech sound discrimination, ba versus da, ga versus ka, et cetera, that I showed you, a series of exercises. And the typically developing children also got those same exercises, the group of them. And then they had a control group of children who just went to school like the other children, but didn't get any specific exercises to train memory and attention. And what you can see is after 6 weeks of doing the Fast Forward program, the language impaired children showed markedly improved attentional skills, and they were much better at ignoring distractions. The typically developing children also improved their attention, and the children who didn't get any treatment at all didn't show any change. So we know that we have breakthrough technology also that improves attention, and we know that for children on the autism spectrum, it also, and children with language impairments, we can also see significant improvements after Fast Forward in language skills. Now, what about dyslexia then? What about children who have a specific diagnosis of reading problems? And here what you see is fMRIs of typical readers, and you can see that the back of their brain is very active, this part of the brain that recognizes words. You can see the top of the temporal lobe that's mapped for the sounds of language is very active in a typical reader. You see the angular gyrus that handles symbols, and you see the frontal lobe active. In children diagnosed with dyslexia, the research has shown that the back of the brain, these back structures are not contributing, they're not part of the network. So the children are using their frontal lobe to try to guess at a lot of the words that they see. And we know that children who are poor readers, not necessarily diagnosed with dyslexia, but struggling readers, tend to have core problems with speech sound discrimination, with working memory, with verbal fluency, and with language. As a matter of fact, if you look at language, different kinds of language tests, children who have reading problems all have one component of language, or maybe two, that is affected. So by creating these breakthrough technologies that understand these maps of the brain and how they're built, and then also building in aspects of what we call plasticity, neurochemistry components to these breakthrough exercises that help children pay attention by focusing their attention specifically, help the children to maintain their interest and motivation with a lot of novel and fun kind of game-like, what looks like a video game to them, and by controlling reward very specifically so that children get very specifically rewarded every time they get something right. We also drive what we call the neuromodulators of learning. And so we can have a very fast impact on changing these underlying cognitive skills that enable learning to be easy and effortless. So what we can say is that what technology does, well-designed programs that build in all this neurochemistry and that also keep in mind these important fiber tracks and these important networks to build, can enhance the capacity of children to remember what they've been told and what they're taught in school, to pay attention to the teacher, to pay attention to the book, to pay attention to what's going on that's relevant to learning, to process quickly and easily and discriminate speech sounds well, and to sequence sounds in words and words in sentences and grammatical forms so that when they enter school, reading is easy. And we have research done by McClellan showing that if all you do is exercise attention and working memory in children, you not only get them to follow classroom rules better, they can sit better, they have their affect, their emotions are under control, but they can learn on demand through listening and watching. So we can improve. We can take a child who's struggling, whose brain looks like this, and this is actually research that was done at Stanford University. Though children whose brains look like this when they were doing what's called a phonological awareness task and were diagnosed with dyslexia, after they went through the Fast Forward language program for 6 weeks, had brains that were functioning much more like a typical brain and were capable of reading well. And if we add something like reading assistant, where the children use their frontal lobe to read aloud and the reading is corrected, we can not only correct some of the bottom-up functions like memory and attention and processing speed, we can also have an impact, what we say top-down, reading. Children who read get better at reading. So by having them also read and have it corrected while they read on a computer, you can have a very powerful set of interventions that can drive these underlying capacities and enable children to read much more easily and to intervene with children who have reading problems. The last thing I just want to comment on is we know from research by Carol Zweck that this research is covered in that Scientific American article that I told you about, published in 2013. But when children believe that they can get smarter, and we have the technology, the breakthrough technology to improve memory and attention and processing speed, those aspects that we consider associated with what makes somebody smart. When children believe they can get smarter, they have much better achievement than children who think that their intelligence is set from the day that you're born, and that if they're good at math, then they'll do well, but if they're not good at math, they won't. That's called a fixed mindset. So not only is it important for us to use technology, this breakthrough technology, to enable children to learn more easily, we also need to share with them that, yes, all of us can learn more easily, and that we have tools out there that help us. And the tools that I am representing are the tools associated with Scientific Learning Corporation, the Fast for Word interventions, and Reading Assistant. So I am finished. Corey, if you have some questions from the audience, I'd be happy to take them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Burns. That was a great presentation. And we're going to start with, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So I've got several here. So we'll try to get through as many as we can. So the first question is there any research to determine which is better for babies, regular adult conversation or baby talk?
Okay, well, the person who's done a lot of that research is Patricia Kuhl, and she is in Seattle, Washington, and she has studied the way parents talk to their children. And what some people may think of as baby talk is actually very good for a child's brain in the early years. So parents naturally raise their pitch, slow down their speech, and repeat themselves a lot. And that's used to be referred to as motherese. Now it's referred to as parentese because both fathers and mothers do this. But it would sound like this. Oh, Jimmy, look. See the bunny? See the bunny hop? Look at the bunny. Look at the bunny. He's hopping. See him hop? Now what mom's done is raised her voice. She's repeated the word bunny several times. She's repeated the word hop several times. Raising her voice like that draws the child's attention in, makes the child interested in what's going on, and actually helps augment learning. And so we know that parentese is helpful to children. Now that's not baby talk that you might associate with simplifying it even further by going bunny, bunny, see, bunny, bunny. But and it's not saying things like wookie, wookie, wookie at the one funny little bunny. It's actually augmenting it. So talking to a child in an adult way with full sentences is helpful to children, but it's even more helpful if we exaggerate and repeat words that are valuable to them and get their attention by changing our voice and slowing it down a little bit.
All right, great. Next question is, what about language received from TV or video games? And this is especially true for kids who don't grow up with a lot of human interaction.
Right. So another research that Pat Kuhl has done a lot with is, can children learn language well from television? And she did a study with children who were American-born, who were being read to in Mandarin Chinese. And they were read to by the same person, sometimes live. So some of the children got the Mandarin Chinese speaker reading a book to them, and these were 18 months old, reading a book to them in Mandarin Chinese, and then another group of them saw her reading the book, the same book, with the same, using the same gestures, but on a television set. The children who had the live person learned the language, learned the Mandarin phonemes, and was able to discriminate them. The children who got it on TV did not. So the simple answer is television does not teach language. And you may know that the American Psychological Association has recommended that children not have television much at all before they're 3 years of age, and after 3 years of age, limit TV or screen time to about 2 hours a day. And the reason is because children learn language much better from a live human being talking to them and interacting with them.
Great. Next question is, are there any particular activities in the language program that would point to a child being dyslexic?
Well, we don't use language programs like the Fast Forward language program to diagnose dyslexia, and there's a reason for that. We can see patterns that would be associated with dyslexia, but to diagnose dyslexia, you really need to have a battery of tests that look at decoding, look at phonological awareness, and we need a specialist who is used to giving those kinds of tests, and those tests need to be standardized with a normal population so that you know that your specific child or a specific child is falling at a significant point that would signal dyslexia. So you can, if you use the Fast Forward language program and you see certain patterns, it can signal to you that that child should have more testing, that they might have dyslexia, but we would never use a program, an intervention program, to diagnose a problem.
Wonderful. Next question is, what's the difference between executive function skills and cognitive skills?
Okay. Cognitive skills include all of the skills that we use to manage, to get through the world. So cognitive skills include attention, they include language, they include your visual ability to get around in space. Cognitive include anything that involves really thinking, if you want to think of it that way. Executive function skills are a subset of cognitive skills, just a set of cognitive skills that include things like paying attention to one stimulus and ignoring others, being able to plan, being able to be organized, being able to be in control of yourself. We call that regulation. So, and those are frontal lobe functions that that involve being able to be effective and productive. So a subset of cognitive skills is executive function skills.
Wonderful. Next question is, this came up frequently in the question, the question section is, what ages can run on Fast Forward?
Oh, good question. There's no upper limit for Fast Forward, so many of us who are speech-language pathologists or who are providers of the Fast Forward programs have used it with adults. I've used Fast Forward programs with adults who've had strokes. I've used Fast Forward with adults who've had traumatic brain injuries, and also adults who've had tumors and had radiation therapy or chemotherapy. But there is a bottom limit because the children do need to have some basic language skills, about the language level of about a 3.5-year-old. They also need to be able to sit still for about 10 minutes at a time and concentrate on an activity, and they need to have some computer skills. They need to be able to use either the computer mouse or a keyboard, just a few strokes of a keyboard. So generally we say that Fast Forward is appropriate for children 4.5 years and above, but if they have a language problem, let's say, we might not want to start it at 4.5 if their language level is still that of a 2.5-year-old. We might want to have some speech and language therapy to improve their ability to follow directions and improve their vocabulary, and then put them on Fast Forward. So bottom is about 4.5 to 5, and no top.
Wonderful. Next question, and I think this might be it, depending on the timing here. Talking about video games in students, this question is, when students, usually boys, choose to play video games and play them several hours a day, can they compromise their reading brain? And does it matter what age they begin to become absorbed in these games?
Okay, so again, I'm going to refer you to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and you can go to their website. And if you go to that website, that would be the association that all of your pediatricians belong to. You will see a couple of recommendations on video gaming and on television. There's a lot of new research, though, on the difference between educational TV and educational video games. A new study just came out a few weeks ago that was done by researchers interested in the difference between children who watch educational programs like Sesame Street versus children who are just watching cartoons that don't have any educational value. And you can imagine that children who watch educational games, the length of time that they watch television is not as much of an issue and can actually be constructive, especially if they're over 3. The same thing with video games. So we have video games that run the gamut from being just entertaining to video games that have some value cognitively. And parents need to discriminate here, because sometimes I had a parent the other day say to me, my child loves to play Angry Birds. And I've been told that Angry Birds is really good for visual spatial skills. And I said, it may be, but we don't have any research to support that. And usually Angry Birds is being used as entertainment. So what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends is no more than 2 hours a day of combined television, if it's not educational, and or video games that are in no way educational. Now, if you were going to do the Fast Forward program, that would be considered educational, and that would not come under that 2-hour limit. But so the answer is yes. We know that when children spend too much time with video entertainment, whether the video entertainment is on a television or whether it's a video game, that does detract from their ability to do other cognitive tasks that we associate with school. And so, but educational video games or educational TV does not fall under that 2-hour-a-day rule.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That will conclude our webinar for today. So I want to thank Dr. Burns for joining us. It was a wonderful presentation.